Randy joined the TNC Michigan chapter in 2002 and the LANDFIRE program in 2007. His scientific specialties include spatial scales from community genetics to mycorrhizal ecology and landscape scale planning. Randy has worked with federal partners and large landowners to promote sustainable management and was the Great Lakes LANDFIRE modeling lead. Randy lives and works in Evanston, Illinois. There you go, Randy.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I know it's a really busy time of year. There's hardly any time of year that's not busy, but with the fire season, I know you guys have a lot on your plate, so thanks so much. As Jeannie mentioned, we're going to go through some introductory material describing a review process that we're starting now. And so along the way, make sure you type up any questions, and if I'm being confusing along the way, make sure and type them in the chat box, and I'll address them on the fly if it's something that will help lead to more clarity. So thanks so much, everyone. Today I want to go into these vegetation models just a little bit. I want to outline the reasons we're doing this biophysical settings review, and I really want to invite you all to help. We really can't do this work without you along. So please kind of have your paper and pencil ready and be ready to jump in at some point if you can. So first, a little bit about LANDFIRE. Many of you have heard of it, and I see some people on the call have definitely contributed to it along the way. Here's some text from landfire.gov, the official web page of LANDFIRE, that gives you a little flavor for it. And I highlighted some words, including update, data, and consistent. So along the way, we're constantly updating and trying to improve our data sets, which is what the call today is about. I also wanted to mention that we try to use a consistent process from place to place. I'll show you some spatial data sets that hopefully illustrate this. And what this means is that hopefully LANDFIRE enables you to do multi-state work or work across other political boundaries. I know in the Great Lakes where I work, different states have different data sets, making it really hard to look across large landscapes because you might bump up into a political boundary and it just makes it really difficult for you to do your work. Also, you'll see that the word land is in green. Something I battle in my part of the world, even though we have fires, is this perception that LANDFIRE is only about fire. And I'll have people literally say, you know, I haven't called you because I thought LANDFIRE was just about fire. It's about vegetation and all the data that you need to plan for vegetation management. I'm going to go into the spatial data sets really briefly first before we jump into the whole modeling bit. So as I mentioned, LANDFIRE delivers a number of vegetation data sets, including existing vegetation type, existing vegetation height, existing vegetation cover. So those together can help you really understand what the landscape is like out there. Also, we sort of deliver a number of historic data sets as well, including fire regimes and the data set we call biophysical settings. All right, so I wanted to show you some of these maps just so you can get a flavor of the data. Here's LANDFIRE's existing vegetation type data, and a couple things to point out. You notice that there aren't state lines in the data set. Obviously, I've got the state boundaries up there, but just to illustrate that the data doesn't stop at a boundary. Also wanted to mention that for this legend, the mapper, the cartographer, chose to map by National Vegetation Classification Standards subclass, just to make it legible. If she had or he had picked all the different existing vegetation types, there would have been hundreds. But I think the maps are beautiful and they really help you understand your landscape. Here's existing vegetation cover with a more complete legend. Still in these data sets you get many attributes to select from. And you'll notice that the maps go wall to wall. And I also show the whole United States as an exaggeration, but is to say that the data sets are meant to be used for covering large areas. They are not meant to plan what to do on a particular stand or in your backyard or small planning units. They are used for doing watershed scale and larger work. So existing vegetation type combined with cover and existing vegetation height allow you to do habitat modeling, for example. I've seen people do a number of bird habitat studies where they'll kind of develop a rule set based on those three data sets. All right, also for the fire managers, we develop fire behavior fuel models, and here's the legend based on the Scott and Bergen 40. And these, in my mind, are some of the most interesting data sets. They're probably the most difficult to develop because they involve mashing together several data sets and then developing rule sets that tell you how to label a particular pixel based on all the inputs. So they're used in several of the fire behavior modeling programs. All right, so here, I'm just for fun showing you the historic fire regime groups. So this is this shows you basically the historic fire regimes across the country. And I should have put up a table, but the different fire regime groups illustrate the frequency and severity of the historic fires as modeled by LANDFIRE and hundreds of experts. Okay, so I showed you several data sets, including some current data sets. And it's maybe I'm working backwards here, but I think it helps to set the framework for what we're embarking on with the review. The biophysical settings model and description bundles are linked to many of the aforementioned data sets. Whether they directly inform the mapping of those data sets or provide guidance, they're really important. And we know that these spatial data sets, while I think they're pretty amazing, they're not perfect. We're always looking to improve. So one way to improve those is to improve the biophysical settings, descriptions, and models, which I'm going to go into a fair bit soon. So here we go, jumping into the BpS or biophysical settings. All right, so these biophysical settings describe, in most general terms, how ecosystems looked and functioned prior to major European settlement. The other day I presented to paleoecologists who are thinking back 10,000 years. That's not what we're doing here. It's almost just prior to major European settlement. We did this to develop sort of an encyclopedia of how these ecosystems looked and worked across the country so that we could better understand these ecosystems. I put in all caps, read, not a prescription. These descriptions and models do not tell you what we think your landscape should look like. They give you some indication of what your landscape may have looked like historically based on the best information we have. To do this, about the time I started with LANDFIRE, we held dozens of workshops and worked with hundreds of experts across agencies, academia, private consultants who helped us do the descriptions and modeling. And I notice Marion Reed is on the call from NatureServe. NatureServe, including Marion, super important for our work. So I would just want to call out NatureServe. And several of you may have participated along the way as well. So at the time, we created roughly 2,000 models and descriptions. And looking back, we were submitting 200 to 400 pages of documentations and models every 2 weeks. It was a pretty crazy time, really fun. And while we know there's lots of room for improvement, we're really happy to have at least sort of got the ball rolling on this thing I like to call the Encyclopedia of Ecosystems. So as I mentioned, each biophysical setting, or you might refer to it as a historic ecosystem, has a textual description that's informed by a state in transition ecological model. All right, so there's two parts, and I know some people get nervous with the modeling part, and I hope that I can make it sound like there is some fun involved with that, and the text descriptions are obviously pretty easy to jump in, read, understand, and review. So for each ecosystem, we worked with experts. In this case, it was a guy named Greg Nowacki to fill in these boxes in an Access database. So you'll see geographic range. Here he put in subsections. And we have biophysical site description, which says where the ecosystem would have occurred based on climate, soils, superficial geology, slope, elevation, aspect, that sort of thing. We also collect disturbance information. Obviously, we describe the vegetation, and there are some other boxes as well. And again, we captured this information in the model tracker database. I wonder if some of you experienced the model tracker database along the way. We have some affection for this thing, even though most people might not. All right, so this is kind of where the fun begins in my mind, right? It's really important to grab those basics like geographic range and biophysical site descriptions. But one thing that I think LANDFIRE added in terms of a national set of descriptions are information on the succession classes or seral states of the biophysical settings. So here you see a couple. We limited each ecosystem to 5 so that it would be manageable across the country. We still had thousands and thousands of succession classes. But here you'll see an example of class A and B, and I've circled a few things. Circled the class label so you could see it more easily. Then also you'll note that my screen just changed. I hope yours didn't. Mine's smaller, so let me know if it shrunk. But circled, it changed again. So I can't see the whole thing at the moment, but I'll go on my memory. Okay, getting better, thank you. Oh, changing. Circled in the top right, you'll see canopy closure, canopy height information. So while we did not try to map where succession classes were on the historic landscape because they move around, we do use those parameters to map succession classes today, making those fields very important. So LANDFIRE will mash together the biophysical settings, the existing vegetation type, height, and cover data, then use these rule sets to map A, B, C, D, and E across the landscape. Also, a few other things I wanted to point out. You'll see that there's a 2 in the top left-hand part of this description. That is how much of the landscape Greg Nowacki modeled to be in this prairie succession class for this oak woodland, presumably in Wisconsin. You'll note that there was more savanna, 12%. These numbers come from modeling of disturbance regimes, and I'll go into that in more detail in a moment. But anyways, you get kind of a sense of what's in these succession classes, and I think that's where LANDFIRE adds a fair bit of value. All right, so to get those percentages and to document all the disturbance regimes, we use Vegetation Dynamics Development Tool, a fairly user-friendly, you might be cringing, a fairly user-friendly modeling platform. So each one of the green boxes represents a succession class, and here you'll see numbers like 0 to 5. That says how many years the succession class would last before it would transition to the next succession class if there was not a disturbance in that succession class. So class A would last 5 years and then succeed to class B if there wasn't some sort of fire or flooding or BIVRI in class A. So anyways, what our modelers would do with our help is open up each one of those succession classes and input how often there would be flooding, wind throw, beaver, BIVRI, stress, fire of 3 types, surface, mixed, or replacement. And then we'd hit run on the model and get an estimate of how much of each one of those succession classes would be on the landscape. So we entered in the basic parameters or basic information for each succession class, as I mentioned before. the type of the disturbance, the annual probability, which is a little different than we normally think of it, but it's just a conversion for return interval. And then we say what happens when there's not a disturbance. The models were run 1,000 years. Since we're looking in the past, we wanted to run the models for 1,000 years so they could settle out, if you will. As you see, it takes a while for the model to kind of equilibrate. And so we did a bunch of testing on this to figure out how long we needed to run the models. And 1,000 years worked well for us. So once we got all the descriptions in the models, there was a lot of back and forth. So there was peer review. Then there was sort of a back and forth between the modeler, reviewers, and ourselves with the Nature Conservancy, sometimes consulting NatureServe and other people along the way to help us do the best we could with the models and descriptions. But we know they can be better, so that's why we're starting off this review. So as I mentioned, this slide probably could have gone a little earlier, but it was, at the time, it was the first cog in the machine of biophysical settings, succession class, and several mapping things. We delivered a bundle every 2 weeks. We were under amazing time stress, and so maybe I put this here to say we know they can be better, and please help us. The models are used in mapping, as I mentioned, for conservation planning, a starting point for later modeling, and for Forest Stewardship Council for certification. So you'll see on this screen an example article written by our colleague Louis Provencher and others, where they used the biophysical settings models to understand how the ecosystems worked historically. Then they amended the disturbances to represent current conditions. So they may have added in fire suppression, invasives, resource extraction, maybe new grazing regimes, other things like that to understand the landscape today. Then, coupled with mapping, they would try to figure out with stakeholders what they wanted the landscape to look like going forward. Then in the modeling software, they would test different management strategies. So it's kind of fun. You can play with the models with people right in a workshop and start exploring what would happen if you were able to do prescribed fire on 10,000 acres a year, or only 5,000 acres a year, or what would happen if you were to do some fencing, or you were to restrict grazing or add grazing, things like that. Then with FSC, or Forest Stewardship Council certification, any of you familiar with that know that you have to document historic conditions and current conditions across the landscape. And you would think I wrote the section because LANDFIRE is very well suited for that sort of work. So I didn't write the section. All right, so the reason we need this review is that we have some blunders, meaning there are some typos, inconsistencies, things like that. Our team is focusing on that. We don't want you to spend your valuable time doing editorial work. But what we do want you to do, if you can, is add in new science. It's been 7-8 years. There's been a lot of new papers, a lot of new research. Maybe we know better how to model the ecosystems. So either you can go in and play with the models, or you can tell us how to play with the models after you look at a document. We missed some opportunities to connect with some of you, with people who have a lot to contribute, so we want to make sure we do that. We're going to try to develop a better delivery system going forward, and we also have updated modeling software now called STSIM. So anyways, a lot of reasons to do this review, and we're excited because we've been living with these models and descriptions that we're proud of, but we also know can be better for 8 years. So we're excited to make them better and deliver them better to you guys for use. So we're kind of pleading with you to help us with that. So how it's going to work is right now, myself, with the help from Jeannie and my colleagues Corey Blankenship and Jim Smith, we're going through those 2,000 or so models. we're lumping identical models, we're cleaning up the models, taking out really old information that may have predated even this modeling effort, and we're trying to make the models easier for you guys to look at and understand and review. So we're doing that now. We're going to post everything to a website called landfirereview.org. And then you guys will be able to go in, download Word documents, just go into track changes, make comments, contact us, and then we'll have the fun job of inserting and dealing with all the comments and suggested changes. So as I mentioned, we're going to post everything to this website, landfirereview.org. And there's going to be a spreadsheet where you can search by different sort of factors to find the ecosystems or biophysical settings you're interested in. And then, as I mentioned, it's just going to be Word documents, nothing too fancy. Working across many agencies and organizations, we had to kind of make it as simple as possible, so that our partners and friends with government firewalls, for example, won't have any problems, we hope. We've done some testing, and we hope that's the case. So right now, we're in the middle of getting those documents ready, and we'll be posting them within the next few weeks and reaching out to you to check them out and provide comments. So I'm going to stop and be ready for questions here, but the reason I stop at this online connections page is that we want this to be a very open, iterative process. We're sort of crowdsourcing here. We're reaching out to tons of people, and as much as we try to make it clear, I'm sure we're going to confuse some people along the way, so we just want to be really open to contact from all of you to answer questions or deal with problems in the models, whatever the case may be. Jeannie and I spoke with some colleagues in Hawaii yesterday who are using the models and for all sorts of fun things, so we're also open to helping you use the models for testing management regimes, for understanding your landscapes, whatever may be the case. So with that, I'm ready for questions. Kind of zoom through things there, but hopefully we can have a bit of discussion. So with that, Stacy, I'm ready for questions.
All right. So it looks like nobody added questions in during the presentation, but I'm going to put this big box here in the center, and you can just type your question there. If for some reason you can also type in the chat there. And also from that last slide that you had, I'm going to point out at the bottom there are some links. And so the LANDFIRE homepage, as well as our homepage, the California Fire Science Consortium, Conservation Gateway, and you can also have that link for emailing LANDFIRE. So if you're interested, want more information, you can either seek that out or contact any of us. We'll put you in touch with the right person. Question, I'll start with this. So what's the timeline for this project?
Oh, great question. Then I noticed Marion added a great question as well. So the timeline is that we're looking at roughly a year for the review, and then it'll probably be roughly, I don't know, 6 months or so added onto that for us to get everything together and to do the quality control on all the models and documents and get them ready to deliver. So something like that. Then I think you can all see this, but Marion Reed asked a great question. Is there any intent to add uncharacteristic states to the models, such as annual grasses dominating post-fire and sagebrush? So the simple answer is no, unfortunately. We are not going to be adding in new boxes. The longer answer is, while we're not going to be adding in new succession classes, we are going to be taking comments that we hope will help people build those boxes in the future. So it's a great question. If you were to take a historic model and bring it up to date, you would need to add in boxes or succession classes, such as Marion mentioned here, which might be cheatgrass or some other invasive to capture the landscape today. So great question, Marion. Okay, yes, we are going to be reviewing the Alaska models and descriptions, and I believe that is roughly the timeline for that. The timeline is a bit in flux because it coincides with a total remap by LANDFIRE, but we are planning on at least a year for the review, and that will include Alaska. So thanks for that.
I'm going to take a minute here while we're waiting for the next question to come in. This is Jeannie again, and I want to remind you that we have a bulletin that comes out about every other month, the LANDFIRE Bulletin. It is available by subscription only. If you would like to get these kinds of updates, full bulletin reports, as well as occasional postcards, we send out postcards when there is news to announce. We don't spam you with anything. You need to opt in. So you can go to our Conservation Gateway site. The links aren't up there yet, but they're around. And you'll have an opportunity to hit an opt-in button. You can send an email to me, care of landfire@tnc.org, and I will send you that opt-in link if you would like to have it, and pass it on to your friends as well. It's one of the ways to keep track of where we are in the BpS review and update, as well as get product updates, reports, other information that you'll find helpful as you do your work.
All right, a couple of good questions. First, John writes, what is the strategy regarding existing vegetation types changing through time? All right, so I'll try to make this reasonably short here. So what LANDFIRE attempts to do is take the original LANDFIRE data called LANDFIRE National, then apply disturbances to that data where they have disturbance information to update the existing vegetation type. So in an easier example, if you have a ponderosa pine existing vegetation type, or lodgepole pine, or something like that, maybe even a shrubland, and LANDFIRE gets information stating that there was a replacement fire, LANDFIRE would then use this vegetation change transition database to change that vegetation in the updated data set to probably be herbaceous if it was a true replacement fire in one of those types. So it's a complicated kind of process where LANDFIRE uses remote sensing, user submitted disturbance events from government agencies, and modeling, and a lot of manual work looking at screens to change the EVT data sets every 2 years to try and incorporate change. It's amazing. It's not perfect. And then coming up, we're going to do a total remap using the latest Landsat imagery, LiDAR where we can, and other data sets to try to improve on that. Yeah, so it's sort of like John mentions in the Q&A. So there's sort of this adding and subtracting thing that happens. So if there's not disturbance, we have modeled sort of growth in the forest vegetation simulator software, so that we try to capture change. And again, it's very iterative, partially automated, partially people at Eros in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, doing a lot of screen time. Then Robert asked a great question about the models in forests and Southern California shrubland types. This is the sort of thing that helps us, Robert, is I didn't know this. Some of our folks probably do know this. What I will do is talk to Corey Blankenship, who's in Oregon and who will be responsible for those Southern California shrubland types. And we've actually hired a consultant to help us with some of those, because we know that they're weak. But I will mention your comment to her, and we may even put in some more effort. We had an issue, for example, with mixed fire, which is really kind of hard to deal with, and in some places controversial in those shrubland types. So, you know what? I think that's a good idea. I can't say I had thought of it, but we knew it was a weakness, hired a consultant to do some help with us so far, identifying problems, and maybe we need to put extra effort going forward in those shrubland types. So I'm making a note of that and appreciate that comment. So Beth asked a great question. Will this review be distinct from the remap process? Yes and no. So our process is led by the Nature Conservancy, and the remap process is led by our partners with the U.S. Geological Survey and Department of, well, excuse me, I'll say the Department of Interior's, Departments of Interior and Department of Ag. Wow, I didn't say that properly. Sorry about that. But we work together, but they will be separate. And hopefully our process will be done in time to inform the remap. So that's our goal. So they are separate. So great questions.
This is Stacy again. Hello, everyone. I also just added a link at the very bottom that's called Evaluation Survey, and it takes about 5 to 10 minutes maybe just to go through and answer some questions about this webinar. This really helps us because we are a grant-funded program, and so being able to report that what we're doing is effective, and also for our own tools to know how we how you knew about this webinar, and also if we can improve things for the future. So just take a few minutes. I'll also send an email out at the end of this in the next week or so with a recording of the webinar, as well as the link to the survey again if you don't take it today. Looks like we have one more question. I'll let Randy take it back.
Yeah, great question. For those working in California, will there be a LANDFIRE point of contact to which we can provide feedback? Generically, we're going to have Jeannie, which is she answers and monitors our landfire@tnc.org email, but also Corey Blankenship, who is in Bend, Oregon, will be the main contact for California. Also, if there are bigger, more programmatic issues that go beyond, say, ways to improve a shrubland model or something like that, it would be Jim Smith, who's the manager of the Nature Conservancy's LANDFIRE team and who sits on what's called the business lead group for LANDFIRE. So yeah, we will be sending out those points of contact for you, and the great question. It'll be Corey Blankenship for you guys in California. And if you go to landfirereview.org, you can see a picture of all of us and have our emails as well. And I also wanted to second Stacy's comment about the survey. We plan to do more of these presentations, so if there's any way I can improve, I would be keen to hear that, or if there's anything that worked especially well. Yeah, really want to improve this presentation, so your feedback's really important, so hopefully you can take a few minutes to do that. John asked another great question. Is there a central place to dive into the details of LANDFIRE veg mapping? Righto. It's hard to find technical documents. John, probably what I would like to do is refer you to a couple papers and then send more links out, because this is a great question. First, you may have found Rollins 2009. Probably goes into the most detail about the original LANDFIRE mapping effort. Then there are a few more papers that have come out in peer-reviewed literature since then that add more detail, but that's a struggle we have. We're constantly in production mode with refresh efforts and the upcoming remap, so it is a challenge for us to keep up with the documentation of things. So I would like to point you to a couple papers along the way. Contact me at rswaty@tnc.org.
And I'll be happy, so when I send that email, it will have the evaluation survey link, a link to the recording, and these papers that Randy's going to send me.
So I think with that, I want to say thanks. I know you guys are really busy. It's amongst the craziest of times in California for you guys. So best of luck with your season there and your work. And we hope to see you on the BpS review, and your comments and questions were most appreciated. So thanks so much. And Stacy, if more questions come in, I trust you'll forward them to me.
Absolutely. All right. Jeannie, anything else you need to mention before we head out for the day?
Landfire@tnc.org is a good primary email address for us as we continue to work with Joint Fire Science program consortia across the country. We want to be able to present webinars in areas that are of most concern for you, to you. If there are topics you'd like to see us explore in this kind of half-hour, 45-minute setting, please drop a note to landfire@tnc.org and we'll try to pull it together for you.
Right. With that, thank you everyone so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in another webinar.